Latin from scratch, relative time. This is a class which is like not necessary, but super necessary. Why am I saying this? Because relative time is a concept which is fundamental for working both with participles and infinitives. Now, I say here, we'll study, or rather, we'll make the effort to understand. Okay, so by this, what I mean is that we don't have to learn by heart what we are about to explain. We have to understand it. Okay, we have to understand. Okay, relative time, which is fundamental to correctly translate participles and especially infinitives. Participles we are going to study in this very module, and infinitives in the next module. Okay, and participles and infinitives are two very important things in Latin and also in Greek. Okay, but now Latin. And first, if we are talking about relative time, is because there is another thing which is absolute time. Okay, so what is the difference between absolute and relative time? First, absolute. Absolute time is measured from the speaker at the moment of the utterance, the now. Okay, this is kind of like a linguistically-ish thing, but simply put, absolute time is the one in main or superordinate clauses, pretty much. Caesar dicit. So this is like absolute time, okay? So, I mean, absolute time is just like the by default time, okay? So, Caesar dicit, Caesar dixit, Caesar dicet. So, Caesar says, Caesar said, Caesar will say, okay? It's just that. Okay, so there's really nothing to understand there. Now, relative time, okay? Relative time, on the other hand, is measured according to the absolute time of the superordinate clause, because simply put, relative time is the one in subordinate clauses. Okay, so relative is relative in relation, no? Relative relation. Okay, so relative time is relative in relation to the absolute. So we measure relative from the absolute time. Okay? Don't worry. It will be super clear. Now, there are three types of relative time. And their names are kind of a mouthful, no? Like mostly this one is kind of hard to pronounce, for me at least. Simultaneity, I guess. The action of the subordinate clause happens at the same time, simultaneously. No, it's quite obvious, no? As the action in the superordinate clause. So both actions occur at the same time, simultaneously. Third, anteriority. The action of the subordinate clause happens before the action in the superordinate clause. And posteriority, the action of the subordinate clause happens after the action in the superordinate clause. Okay? I think this is quite straightforward. Now, very important. Why am I not talking about, because at first we could think, why not just call it present, past, and future? Because it's not the same. Okay, it is not the same. It might be the same, but many times not necessarily it is the same. Okay, we are going to see. Latin can express different relative times through the different infinitives and participles, present, perfect, future, which we will study soon. The difficulty, or rather big difference between Latin and English, or between Latin and Spanish, or any other languages that you might know, is that both English infinitives and participles have lost much of the time content. We'll see. That is why quite often we will have to convert Latin non-finite verbs, that is, participles and infinitives, into English finite forms, that is, English third person singular, like I have, he has, had, etc. Okay? So the English verbs express their relative time expressed by the Latin participles or infinitives. Okay, again, this is kind of complicated right now, but it is going to be super clear. Okay, now we have this table. We don't have to learn the table. We have to understand the table, and you will see that it is easier than it looks so far, okay? Because I have been saying a lot of things, now there is a table, etc. Relax. Okay, now, how do we do this table? First, we have the main clause. We said the absolute time is the time in the main clause or superordinate clause, okay? So present, perfect or imperfect, so past and future, okay? So pretty much what we did before, Caesar knows, before I think I have Caesar says, it's the same obviously, okay? So Caesar knows, Caesar knew, Caesar will know, okay? So present, past, future. Now, each of these absolute times can have a relative time, okay? So present, anteriority, simultaneity, posteriority. And the same here and the same here, okay? So let's begin with the relative time in relation with the absolute time present, okay? So anteriority, which means the subordinate clause which expresses relative time, if this action happens before this in the present, then we would say Caesar knows that the Germans cross the river. So this happens before. No? First, the Germans crossed the river, and then obviously Caesar knows that they have done that. Then Caesar knows, now this and this happens at the same time, or more or less the same time. Okay? So Caesar knows that the Germans cross the river, or that the Germans are crossing the river. Okay, so both things are at the same time. Okay, and then posteriority. Caesar knows now that the Germans will cross the river, or that the Germans are going to cross the river, etc. Okay, so this is quite simple. Okay, because when the absolute time is the present, then anteriority pretty much is past, simultaneity pretty much is present, and posteriority pretty much is future. So it's quite intuitive. Now, this is a bit more complex, okay, but we will understand it quite easily. Imperfect. So this happened in the past. Now, anteriority. This also happened in the past, but this happened before this, okay? So Caesar knew that the Germans had crossed the river. No? If you remember when we said when we were studying the pluperfect, we said the pluperfect is something in the past which happened before something also in the past. So here we have the pluperfect. No? Caesar knew that the Germans had crossed the river. Now, simultaneity. Caesar knew that the Germans crossed the river, that the Germans were crossing the river, etc. Caesar knew, and now posteriority. And this one is the least intuitive at first, but you will see, yeah, that's what I would say, no? Caesar knew that the Germans would cross the river, or that the Germans were going to cross the river. So we use conditional for the posteriority in relation with the past. Or it can be either conditional or we're going to. Okay? So think about this and you will see that it is true. Okay? Now, future. This is not so common. Okay? So this one is quite easy because it's super intuitive. Now, this one is quite common and is not so intuitive. So this one I would say is the most important. Now, this is not so common. Okay? But still, Caesar will know. Now, anteriority. If you remember when we were studying the future perfect or perfect future, we said the future perfect is something in the future which happens before another thing also in the future. So here we have it. Caesar will know that the Germans will have crossed the river. Okay? Then, simultaneity. Caesar will know that the Germans will be crossing And then you see here I have written an asterisk because this is kind of like doesn't make much sense, okay? But Caesar will know that the Germans will cross the river. Maybe it's hard to express the posteriority with the future, okay? So there's not really any stable way to do that. Okay, so the table. Again, you don't have to learn by heart the table. You just have to understand like anteriority, simultaneity, posteriority, and how to express this, or this in relation to the or with the present, imperfect, or perfect, and the future. That's it, okay? It is not so hard. Just you can even maybe like try to do your own sentences, okay? Just like this with the same structure, but just do your own sentences. It's going to be quite easy, okay? Then if you still struggle to understand it completely, maybe say things like, Caesar knows now that the Germans crossed the river yesterday. Caesar knew yesterday that the Germans had crossed the river the day before yesterday, and things like that, okay? Like say some adverb or time expression which says what happened before or after, etc. And you will see that it's just this, okay? It's not so hard. And now you might be saying, okay, we have been studying all this relative time thing, which looks kind of complex or a lot of information, a table, etc. But where are the infinitives? Where are the participles? We haven't seen any participle or infinitive here. We will super soon, okay? Starting in 2 classes. But how does this apply to the participles and infinitives? This relative time is expressed in infinitives and participles by the stems tenses. Okay, so for example, if we have a perfect infinitive, that means that the infinitive, and of course you will see that there is more than one infinitive in Latin. There are 6 infinitives in Latin, etc. Okay, so they have so many infinitives because they express different things. Okay, so the perfect infinitive expresses anteriority, the present infinitive simultaneity, and the future posteriority, etc. Okay, so it's quite easy. And last, some last remarks. Okay, this is just like to give some extra information. This is really not important. It's just some reflections, let's say. We have to exclude, because here I'm saying, some kind of linguistic reflections to finish off. Let's take a look at the requirements of the expression of relative time. We have to exclude, because for example, like we were seeing before, I know that something will happen, or that something has already happened, or that something is happening right now. So with that, we can express all the relative times. Okay, but sometimes relative time just doesn't make sense, let's say. Okay, so verbs such as see, hear, etc., that is direct perception, like we are seeing now. Okay, so one cannot have direct perception of something already happened or yet to happen. Here this is from. So these verbs require simultaneity. That is, these verbs only can have simultaneous actions. Then, verbs such as remember, regret, etc., one cannot remember or regret something that hasn't happened yet, of course. So these verbs require anteriority. Okay, so I cannot regret something which I haven't done yet. Okay, or I cannot remember something that hasn't happened. So always anteriority, something that has happened or that I have done. And subordinate clauses that themselves express relative time. Final and consecutive clauses always express posteriority. No, obviously, like final, I do something in order to achieve something in the future. Consecutive is the same. Causal clauses always express anteriority. No, like this consequence is caused by something which of course happened before. manner clauses always express simultaneity, etc. Okay, so as I said, this last part is like, okay, just some extra information. The important part is actually this, the table. Okay, the table, we have to understand it. And now in the next class, let's start studying the participles.